This research is as part of a team. There were two of us at UCLA and two at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Iztapalapa in Mexico City. And I also want to thank, we were funded by the UC Mexis program, and also just to thank the organizations that took part in the study and helped us with this understanding. So the motivation for this study is that among groups of informal workers that have organized and made demands in the United States and Mexico, perhaps the two most successful are both groups that function in public space, the day laborers in the United States. I should say, day laborer translates as jornalero, pero es más jornalero urbano, que trabajan en construcción. And then in Mexico, it's the case of the street vendors. So the puzzle is, why is it that these groups of workers have been particularly effective given the challenges of acting in public space, and how they've done it, and how does it turn out differently in the two countries given the different institutional environments? I'm going to sort of gloss over a lot of parts of this, but just want to focus on the sectors here. So in Mexico, it's informal street vendors. I want to emphasize that although this is a two-country study, it's really a two-city study of Mexico City and Los Angeles. And so in the United States, it's the day laborers. Mexico is a much larger informal sector, a group of informal workers, but by most accounts, informality is also growing in the United States. The way we undertook this was to do case studies of organizations involving interviews and participant observation, as well as some secondary sources, basically archives of the organizations. We held two binational meetings of leaders of the organizations to sort of engage them. And it's a small number of cases, although we would argue representative of the two cities and of the two countries. So here are the cases. In Mexico, there's one group that really only extends to the neighborhood level in Coyoacán in Mexico City, a group of artisans. And there's a much broader Mexico City level group, the Frente Nacional del Comercio Informal. In the United States, there's a set of neighborhood level job centers, and then there's two city level organizations. One is the Institution of Popular Education in Southern California, and the Central American Resource Center, both of which have organizations of day laborers. And then the national organization in this case is the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, which is also headquartered in Los Angeles. So in Mexico, actually, both of these street vendor organizations, to some extent, came out of the fragmentation of street vendor organizations that took place in the 1990s. They used to be much more consolidated. At a point when the ruling party, the PRI, moved to neoliberalism, a number of the leaders were jailed and new organizations arose. So the Frente Nacional arose in 2004. It started out with used clothing vendors and spread out from there. The artisanal group in Coyoacán arose in the mid-1990s. The organizations in the United States, the sort of local level organizations really arose in the 1980s, coming particularly out of Central American migrations, as it turns out. Central Americans fleeing the civil wars in the 1980s formed the cornerstone of these organizations, and the national organization is quite new, formed only in 2001, although growing out of an expanding set of collaborations at the Los Angeles level, at the regional level, and then finally building to the national level. Here's the point of overlap, I think, between the two presentations, is that in both cases, there's a defense of the right to ply their trade in public space. In one case with the street vendors, the entire process, I mean, obviously they build up their stock somewhere else, but the selling process happens in public space. For the day laborers, it's a question of seeking jobs in public space, standing on street corners or in the parking lot of a Home Depot store to seek work. Increasingly, there's been a focus not just on public space, which in some ways is a resolved issue in many parts of the country, but on immigration policy and on the risk of deportation of undocumented workers and laborers. There's also a set of economic development strategies. In the case of Mexico, the organizations actually try to establish a monopoly of street vending in particular geographic areas. In the United States, there's a policy of not-establishing monopoly, but instead trying to establish a minimum wage, say $15 an hour at the level of a Home Depot parking lot, but not limiting participation to members of a particular organization. There's also a set of other sort of economic development skills building processes that, as well as the centers that help workers negotiate with potential day-by-day employers that in this United States case. There's a set of other services that the organizations carry out, and in some cases there's a leadership development process. Although the Frente Nacional is a much more vertical organization where leadership development is not a major consideration. In Mexico, there's a combination of protest, negotiation, and dialogue, and to some extent the organizations are a combination of a trade organization, worker advocacy. In the United States, it's a sort of more complicated hybrid that in some ways it's a labor intermediary that helps bridge between workers and employers. In some ways it functions like a labor union trying to set standards. In some ways like a community organization doing popular education, and so on. And relating to neighbors, which is important in terms of the issues of public space. In both cases, self-organization is the cornerstone of the entire process. Oops. Alliances have been critical to defending the right to public space and winning other kinds of demands as well. So in Mexico, there's two types of alliance models. The Frente Nacional has more vertical alliances with politicians and journalists. The ANAC, the artisans organization, has more horizontal partnerships with other organizations in the Coyoacan market area. In the United States, there's a set of alliances with labor and Latino organizations for sort of legal defense, for example, of the right to solicit jobs in public space, working with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. With the AFL-CIO, the Union Federation, basically an alliance based on the AFL-CIO seeing very great losses in membership and seeking new groups of organized workers, and the day laborers beginning to experience very extreme repression as once the immigration regime shifted to a more repressive, deportation-focused regime. There's also an implicit alliance with Latino voters and protesters that sort of powers this whole process. That means that politicians have one eye on the Latino voting base. And I had this little note that in California, there's a much larger Latino voting presence than in Arizona. The laws that are adopted in the two neighboring states reflect that. In both countries, there's a spectrum of organizational models. In Mexico, ranging from basically organized crime to a much more participatory model. Not aware of day labor organizations that take an organized crime form in the United States, but certainly ones that have more of a a straightforward social service orientation as opposed to a more grassroots sort of popular education model. In each case, they've had to adjust to big changes, change in the party of government in Mexico City, a set of aggressive urban renewal pushes to sort of clear out the centro histórico of Mexico City and to preserve it for tourists, to get rid of the merchants. And in the United States, really the big challenge has been the shift in immigration law that means that regardless of the right to be in public space, there's repression directed against them as migrants. So there's a set of similarities in terms of these fights over public space. They have to build political power because they don't really have economic control over their fates. They're combining negotiation and process, and they win to the extent that they are able to build alliances with powerful allies. There's a set of differences that in the Mexican case, the Frente Nacional, which is the more successful of the two groups, has basically bargained as a vote bank and has won political support by promising votes. And whereas in the United States, there's much more focus on developing internal leadership and relationship building with neighbors from these day labor sites. There's a somewhat more entrepreneurial self-image in Mexico, and whereas in the United States, these folks are seeing themselves really as workers, as employees. And in both cases, there's a defense of the right to solicit work in public space. But as I mentioned earlier, the Mexican groups actually try to have a group monopoly on this right in particular areas. The United States has these organizations have a more open approach, and of course there's also this piece of dealing with immigration reform, which really has become the top priority of the day laborers, the National Day Laborers Organizing Network. Why are they different? Well, okay, let's look at the histories and environments of these organizations. In Mexico, the founders of these organizations are basically street vendors and lawyers, and the focus is very much on the right to sell. In the United States, these organizations were formed by Salvadorian leftists who fled the Civil War, who brought a much broader vision of popular education. That's at the core of these organizations. In Mexico, the vote bank approach works because these are citizens who can vote. In the United States, a large number, nobody knows the percentage, but surely the majority of day laborers are non-citizens, cannot vote, and so the vote bank approach is not going to work. There's a long history of, actually, 2 weeks ago I was at a conference and presented some other work out of this, and a Mexican colleague corrected me and said, well, actually, it moved from a corporatist system to now it's a clientelist system. But in any case, it's always been sort of a patron-client type of relationship in Mexico. There's more discretion in application of the law in Mexico. In the United States, clientelism is more limited, and in any case, only applies to voters for the most part. And things are a little closer to the rule of law, so that there's a larger role in this case for litigation legislation as opposed to protest and vote mongering. Interesting distinction is that the street vendors in Mexico City can say, we were selling here before the Spanish came. And it's true that the Changuis tradition in Mexico goes back many hundreds of years from before the Spanish arrived. So they have a moral claim to be doing what they're doing where they're doing it. So there are common challenges leading to common responses, in terms of this focus on public space. Again, this focus on politics. The particular institutional and political environment sets some of the parameters, but also the history and ideology. So whether you were founded by lawyers and street vendors or by Salvadorian leftists has something to do with where you end up. Let me just do this slide, which to some extent diagrams in a very simple summary that how they win, which is that self-organization allows you to build some legitimacy, some credibility, and some organizational capacity. All this allows you to build successful and effective alliances, which then help you win political power to win the reforms you need. So that's the basic story here, whether it's public space or immigration reform in the case of the United States. That's what's going on.